This case is a tragedy. Austin Metcalf, only 17 years old, was stabbed and mortally wounded on April 2nd, 2025, at a high school track meet, of all things. And Karmelo Anthony, who was also 17 at the time, is on trial for M. He allegedly attacked Metcalf in the chest with a knife. Anthony is claiming self-defense. If he's convicted, he will face 5 years to life in prison. Although Anthony was 17 at the time of the stabbing, Texas law considers 17-year-olds to be adults. Closing arguments are scheduled for tomorrow morning, after which a jury will have the case and start deliberations. Now, this is interesting. Judge John Roach Jr. has ordered the jury to be sequestered from the outside world at a hotel with no access to television or phones and only an emergency number for family members. That's interesting. We don't see that happening much anymore. And also, I noticed the difference between Texas and Massachusetts. They had a trial. Part of the testimony occurred on a Saturday. We wouldn't have that here. So, very interesting for me to observe that. In the meantime, welcome to the Margaret McLean Show. I'm your host, Margaret McLean. I'm your courtroom translator. I'm a former prosecutor and civil trial lawyer. I'm here to take you behind the scenes and explain the law. I also taught law at Boston College, so I really enjoy teaching, and I'm hopeful that you guys will learn something on my channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Press the like button and turn those notifications on. As a former prosecutor, one of the biggest misconceptions I see in cases like this is the belief that self-defense depends on who started the argument. Who threw the first punch or shove, or who was more afraid. Legally, though, the question is much narrower than that. So, did Karmelo Anthony reasonably believe that deadly force was immediately necessary to protect himself from death or serious bodily injury? That's the question. That single question may determine whether this is legally justified self-defense or first-degree M. The facts themselves are not particularly complicated in this case. So according to prosecutors, Anthony entered a team tent during a rainstorm. Of course, this is during a track meet. It was raining on and off. And I guess at this point it was raining really badly, and his team did not have a tent. Witnesses say he was asked to leave as many as 15 times. Several students testified that Anthony refused to leave and responded at one point with the warning, "Touch me and find out." All right. The prosecution says Austin Metcalf eventually pushed Anthony, at which point Anthony pulled a knife from his backpack and attacked him only once in the chest, and that was it. The defense tells, of course, a different story. They argue that Anthony was significantly smaller than Metcalf, so they make a big deal about size. He was confronted by multiple students in this tent. He felt threatened and made a split-second decision during what they describe as fear and chaos. So that split-second decision to pull out the weapon and stab. The question, of course, is whether a reasonable person in Anthony's position would have believed that stabbing Austin Metcalf with a knife was necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury. That is a very high legal standard. Texas law does not require someone to retreat before using force in certain situations. However, many people misunderstand what that actually means. A no duty to retreat law does not automatically justify deadly force. The person claiming self-defense must still show that the threat was serious enough to warrant a deadly response. That may be the biggest hurdle facing the defense at this point. This was a relatively short trial. The prosecution called 21 witnesses and the defense called 8. Witnesses included teens who were present during the confrontation under the tent, which I have shown here, and they appear to agree on several critical points: that Austin Metcalf was unarmed, no weapon was ever displayed by Metcalf or anyone else in the tent. The confrontation also lasted only a short time, according to witnesses, and people also said that Anthony warned the students not to touch him before the physical contact occurred. Jurors have also heard evidence that Anthony brought a knife onto school property where weapons were prohibited, and now, of course, we can see why. Then there is Anthony's own statement after the stabbing. According to testimony, when officers detained him, he reportedly said, "I am not alleged, I did it." So that's an admission. He also repeatedly stated, "He put his hands on me." Okay. Now, I want you to think about that statement. From a prosecutor's perspective, that statement may become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire trial. It suggests that Anthony's explanation was not that he feared death, it was that Metcalf touched him. The defense will likely argue in closing arguments, which are tomorrow, that those statements came from a frightened teenager in shock immediately after a traumatic event. I don't see it being a strong argument. The prosecution will argue they reveal exactly why the stabbing happened. Because he got touched. Not because he was scared, because he got touched. Now, Anthony did not testify, and that decision does not surprise me. It's not unusual. Criminal defendants have an absolute constitutional right not to testify. And of course, jurors will be instructed that they cannot hold that decision against him. But it does mean that the defense's story, that self-defense story, had to come from other witnesses. Now, one of Anthony's former teammates testified that Anthony appeared distraught immediately after the stabbing. According to the witness, Anthony repeatedly said, "I told him not to touch me. I told him not to touch me." Now, notice how similar that statement is to what jurors have already heard from the school resource officer, who also testified, and other students. Again, the focus is on physical contact, not on fear of imminent death. So that is a key distinction. Of course, that distinction will be debated during deliberations. I mean, it's the crux of the case. The defense tried to establish that Metcalf initiated the physical confrontation and that Anthony reacted during a chaotic, rapidly unfolding situation, right? Witnesses acknowledged that Metcalf pushed or shoved Anthony before the stabbing occurred. The defense argues that the size difference disparity between the two teenagers is also significant. Anthony was substantially smaller than Metcalf, and I bet that during deliberations, jurors will be asked to consider whether that physical difference contributed to Anthony's own perception of danger, right? But I believe that the prosecution has presented testimony that simply cuts in the opposite direction. Several student witnesses testified that Anthony refused repeated requests to leave the tent. One witness estimated Anthony was asked to leave as many as 15 times. Jurors also heard testimony that Anthony responded by saying, "Touch me and find out." We just talked about that. One student testified that Anthony appeared to be the one provoking the confrontation. Another said there was no effort to gang up on Anthony and that Austin Metcalf did not appear to be looking for a fight. So jurors are going to be assessing the credibility of each and every one of these witnesses. Were they friends? Were they biased, right? So perhaps I think the most damaging for the defense was a witness who testified that students believed Anthony was bluffing when he placed his hand inside the backpack. According to that witness, nobody expected him to actually use a knife. Then came the fatal moment. Witnesses testified that Metcalf pushed Anthony. Anthony allegedly pulled a folding knife from his backpack and stabbed Metcalf in the chest. Jurors heard testimony that Metcalf stood up, lifted his shirt, saw blood covering his chest, and said, "I think I got stabbed." Another witness recalled hearing him say, "Oh my God." And of course, there was gruesome testimony to that effect and to what happened. And it was tough on the family. And I'm sure jurors were looking at family members sitting out there. And of course, they were probably looking at family members from both sides on this one. Overall, the law permits people to defend themselves, but the law does not automatically permit someone to respond to a shove with a knife, right? This is why the prosecution has repeatedly emphasized that Metcalf was unarmed, that no weapon was ever displayed, and that Anthony brought the knife onto school grounds himself. The defense, meanwhile, is asking jurors to place themselves in Anthony's shoes and evaluate what he perceived in a rapidly escalating confrontation. Now, both sides have rested, the evidence is in, the witnesses have testified. I'll be following closing arguments tomorrow. Prosecutors, I anticipate, will weave the evidence into a story of accountability and unlawful violence. The defense will tell a story of fear, split second decision making, and self preservation, which equals self defense. And then the case belongs to the jury, of course, after the judge's instructions. Their job is to decide. Remember, did Karmelo Anthony reasonably believe that stabbing Austin Metcalf was immediately necessary to prevent death or serious bodily harm? If the answer is yes, the law may require an acquittal. If the answer is no, jurors may conclude that this was not self-defense at all, but first-degree M. Thank you for watching The Margaret McLean Show. Be sure to subscribe and press the like button. I'll be following this case to the bitter end. Good night.